Welcome back to Law Made Simple. You're with me, Bempo Mwale, and today we are diving into a case that made headlines both here in Malawi and internationally, and that is the case of Eric Aniva. Some of you might be familiar with this name because it really created some noise around the world. So this case does not only talk about the law, it talks about culture, human rights. So it's a very controversial case when you think about it, and it leaves a lot of question marks. So that I'll leave up to you to give me your opinions about this case, whether you feel like the story ended badly for the accused, or what other issues do you believe this case brings about? Okay, so who is Eric Aniva and why was he arrested? What were the main legal issues? And what does this case tell us about the tension between cultural practices and the constitution, as I mentioned? So let's break it all down. First of all, this is the whole story behind the case. Eric Aniva lived in Sanje, which is the southern part of Malawi, and he basically gained global attention after he had a certain BBC interview describing his role as Hyena, and we locally call it Fisi. Now, hyena in this context, it refers to somebody that, okay, it's in two ways. The first one is called kulowa kufa. So this is a cleansing ritual where widows are expected to have sexual intercourse with a man, and this man is the one we call Fisi after their husbands pass away. They say it's a cleansing ritual because when it is believed that when somebody dies, they leave around some lingering energies. So they're trying to get rid of that. There are other practices that encompass this whole kulowa kufa thing, but then the main issues we're talking about here is this part where Fisi, which is a hired man, it could also be a woman, so I've heard, and they're hired to have sex with a widow or a widower as a way of cleansing the person. So the second part of this role of Fisi is that practice that is called kusasafumbi. So these practices are commonly practiced in the southern part of Malawi, and kusasafumbi is where this Fisi is called, and he is supposed to sleep with young girls that have just attained puberty, basically. So that's the whole role, job description, I guess I'll put it that way, of this Fisi. Yes, so this documentary, or rather the interview that Eric Aniva had with BBC, it triggered a lot of responses, and the then president, who was Peter Mutharika, ordered that he be arrested. So he was charged under the Gender Equality Act for engaging in harmful cultural practices. But then in court, the court focused on the conviction specifically on kulowa kufa, which was sleeping with these married women after their husbands die. So the other main issue why this was deemed a harmful practice and why Eric was subsequently convicted is because he had sexual intercourse with multiple women, countless women, and he was HIV positive. But apparently, I do not know, but apparently this this practice rather of kusasafumbi, and you being a Fisi, you're not supposed to disclose your status. It is rather not important. Yeah, so that was why this was deemed to be a harmful practice. and why he got convicted and subsequently sentenced to 2 years. Okay, so what were the legal issues in this case? Let's talk about the big issues. The first issue we have charges and the evidence. So Aniva was charged under the Gender Equality Act, which prohibits harmful practices. But then here's the thing. No victims or witnesses testified against him. There were no widows, there were no girls, there was no witness. And there were no victims that came, though they basically used his words that he said during the interview. And maybe a question that can be put here is, can a conviction really stand on a media interview alone? Maybe it's something we should think about. And the second issue was, the accused is presumed innocent until proven guilty. That's the law, and he has the right to a fair trial. But Aniva's charges were vague. They didn't really specify what he was being charged with, and the media outcry was mostly about him sleeping with young girls, but the court focused on kulowa, kufa, where he had slept with multiple widows as the cleansing ritual. So the charges were vague, the evidence was very thin. There's also the issue of bail, because Aniva was denied bail and he spent 5 months in custody. That was before his trial ended. So some questions here can be, because the Constitution says bail should be granted to anybody, and the exception is if the accused might flee or interfere with witnesses. But then we see this case did not have any witnesses. It did not have any victims that came to testify. So those are some questions that maybe we can also ask when it comes to whether he was given a fair trial, or if his rights of a fair trial were observed, or was it just because of the public pressure? Was public pressure a factor? And another issue here that we might look into is media and public pressure. So let's not forget that his arrest came from the president, because he's the one that directed that he be arrested, and this case was like on the public spotlight. So did this influence how the court handled the case? Was justice truly served? When you think about the media and the public pressure, and we're talking about the directive coming from the president. So I think that's also something maybe that this case, the question that this case brought about. And another issue perhaps that we can look into is, was the magistrate court the right forum to hear his case? Because here's the critical point here. And if its case dealt with deep constitutional questions, and the Gender Equality Act protects against harmful practices, but at its core, it's pretty much a constitutional right, because there was like a tension between cultural rights and fundamental human rights. So the Constitution recognizes customary law, yes, which includes these cultural practices that have been with us since time immemorial, but it also guarantees dignity and protection from harmful traditions. So these are constitutional issues, and one would wonder why this case was tried in a magistrate court. And then we come back to the media and public pressure. This was a presidential directive. So that could be some issues that this case brought about, some questions that this case brought about. As I've mentioned, this case is about Aniva who was charged for being involved in these practices, the so-called harmful practices that he was involved in. But then here's a food for thought when it comes to culture and constitution and basically this whole case, because there's something to think about here. The constitution recognizes customary law. It's part of our legal system, but it also guarantees fundamental rights like the right to dignity and the protection of harmful practices. So what happens when cultural practices conflict with these constitutional rights? Because customary law is recognized by the constitution itself. So cases like the Aniva's case show us that there's like a tricky balance there. On the one hand, cultural practices are part of our identity and heritage, and on the other hand, some of these practices can be harmful to other individuals, especially the vulnerable groups like women and children. So in this case, in Aniva's case, the court ruled that practices like kulowa, kufa violated the Gender Equality Act. But these can also raise these questions that we're talking about, that does criminalizing these practices mean we're erasing part of our culture? How do we decide which cultural practices are acceptable and which ones are not? And what does it truly mean for the future of customary law in Malawi? Okay, but then Aniva was charged with 2 years. He did file for an appeal during when he was in custody, but then the appeal was not heard until he served the whole term, 2 years. So even after his conviction, we had others saying 2 years is too little, and we were saying 2 years is little, but then to some extent, did Aniva take the fall for the people that practice this tradition? Did he take the fall? Not just for the people that practice it, but for Malawi in general, because it's something that we've known has been happening, but nothing was done until he went on air and started to elaborate on his role as Fisi. And then when it attracted international stakeholders, that's when we came in to say, oh, okay, so this is happening, but it's something that we've known that it has been happening. So did he take the fall? So it shows that the tension between preserving culture and protecting human rights is really there. And it also reminds us that justice should be impartial and it should not be easily swayed by the media or political pressure. Because another question that arose with this case was that, was it because it was the president that directed his arrest? So it was basically a prima facie case that, okay, he's guilty, the president said so, let's do away with it. Okay, wrapping up. That's it for today's episode of Law Made Simple. Eric Aniva's case is about more than just one man. It's about how we as a society navigate the complex relationships between culture, human rights, and the law. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time as we continue to make sense of Malawi's legal maze. Bye-bye.